The proximity alarm chirped exactly 3 times before David Reeves decided it was probably just another dust devil setting off the sensors. New Hebron's atmosphere had a talent for making expensive security equipment look stupid, and his workshop sat far enough from the main colony that wildlife, or what passed for it on this rust-colored rock, occasionally triggered false readings. He was elbow-deep in a malfunctioning atmospheric processor, trying to convince a stubborn valve assembly that corrosion wasn't a permanent lifestyle choice when the alarm chirped again. Longer this time. Insistent. Yeah, David muttered, wiping grease on his already filthy coveralls. I'm coming. The workshop's external camera showed nothing but the usual landscape of red dirt and scattered equipment. He cycled through the feeds twice, squinting at the grainy images, before finally grabbing his jacket and heading outside. The twin suns were setting, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow that made depth perception a nightmare. He found her collapsed against the storage unit's blast door. At first glance, just another casualty, torn military fatigues, armor scorched black in places, blood pooling dark against the red dirt. David's hand was halfway to his comm unit when he noticed the ears, elongated, tapered, catching the dying light like they'd been carved from something precious. Lyren. His mind immediately offered helpful suggestions. Call security, step away, pretend he'd never seen this. Harboring an enemy combatant carried sentences that made indentured servitude look appealing. But her breathing came in shallow gasps, and there was enough blood that calling anyone would just mean watching her die with official witnesses present. This is monumentally stupid, David told her unconscious form, hooking his arms under her shoulders. She was heavier than she looked, military muscle beneath the damage. He dragged her inside, trying not to think about plasma burns or internal bleeding or the dozen ways this could end with him in a detention cell. His workshop wasn't equipped for field medicine, but improvisation was his specialty. Plasma sealant designed for hull breaches worked surprisingly well on cauterized wounds. Medical supplies from his civil defense kit, the one he'd never expected to actually use, supplemented the rest. Her hand suddenly gripped his wrist with startling strength, and she murmured something in liquid syllables he didn't understand before going limp again. David sat back on his heels, looking at what he'd done. The line he'd crossed wasn't just visible. It was glowing neon in his peripheral vision, announcing that his quiet, unremarkable life had just become significantly more complicated. But her armor bore markings he didn't recognize, elaborate patterns that seemed too ornate for standard issue, and something about her face, even slack with unconsciousness, suggested someone used to being obeyed. "Who are you?" he asked the silence. The workshop's recycled air hummed its usual response, nothing helpful whatsoever. 3 days of lying to people taught David that he was terrible at it. When Markov from the processing plant asked why he'd missed poker night, David's brain offered intestinal distress as an excuse, which led to 20 minutes of unsolicited medical advice he definitely hadn't needed. When Chen stopped by unannounced, David had physically blocked the doorway while explaining his workshop was undergoing fumigation for electrical parasites, which wasn't even a real thing. The woman, Lyren, enemy, whatever label applied, remained unconscious through all of it, breathing steadily on the improvised cot David had assembled from equipment cases and thermal blankets. He'd checked her vitals obsessively, changed bandages, and tried very hard not to think about treason charges. On the morning of the 4th day, while David was attempting to eat reheated protein paste that tasted like optimistic cardboard, her eyes opened. They were amber. Not metaphorically, not poetically, actually amber, like someone had stolen sunset and concentrated it into irises that caught the workshop's fluorescent lighting and threw it back transformed. She went for a weapon that wasn't there, her hand slapping empty deck plating. David raised both hands slowly, the protein paste forgotten. "Easy. You're safe, relatively speaking." Her gaze swept the workshop, cataloging exits and threats with obvious military training. When it landed back on him, David tried his most non-threatening smile. "I'm David, engineer, terrible combat statistics. You were bleeding out against my storage unit." She said something in her own language, liquid and sharp simultaneously. The translation implant he could see nestled against her temple flickered erratically, damaged. She winced, then switched to heavily accented English. "Why? Why did I help?" "Well, I have this character flaw where I dislike watching people die. My therapist says it's very inconvenient." Something almost like humor flickered across her face. "Therapist. Mandated after I told my supervisor that his management style reminded me of vacuum exposure. Painful and ultimately fatal." David ventured closer, checking the medical readouts on his jury-rigged monitor. "Your translator's fried. I might be able to fix it, but it'll take time." She processed this, her expression carefully neutral despite obvious pain. Named Lyren. Over the next hours, they built communication from fragments. Lyren had been part of a reconnaissance unit, ambushed during what should have been a ceasefire verification. She didn't explain why she'd ended up alone near his workshop, miles from any combat zone, and David didn't push. Some survival instinct told him certain questions had dangerous answers. What surprised him was her humor. When he apologized for his crude suturing work on her shoulder, she examined it critically and said, "Had worse. From friends. Your friends need better hobbies." "Yes, perhaps engineering." David found himself grinning despite everything. She watched him work on her translator with obvious fascination, asking questions about his repurposed equipment. He explained how mining lasers could be recalibrated for medical cauterization, and she described Taran energy matrices in broken English that still made more technical sense than half his training manuals. Neither acknowledged the obvious. This couldn't last. The outside world wouldn't understand. They were from opposite sides of a conflict neither seemed to believe in. But for now, in the fluorescent hum of the workshop, they had an unexpected ease that felt almost like trust. David discovered the secondary data core on a Tuesday, which seemed appropriate since Tuesdays had always been his unlucky day. He'd been working on Lyren's translator for the better part of a week, and the armor's breastplate had been stubbornly refusing to yield its internal components without a fight. "Your people design everything like it's meant to survive planetary bombardment," he muttered, finally prying loose the reinforced panel. Lyren, now mobile enough to sit at his workbench, made a sound that might have been agreement. "Should survive is point. My people prefer things that can be fixed with basic tools and moderate cursing." The data core sat nestled in the lining, matte black and significantly more sophisticated than anything a standard soldier should carry. David's engineering curiosity wrestled briefly with common sense. Curiosity won. It usually did. His decryption software, acquired during academy days for reasons he preferred not to examine, made quick work of the outer layers. The files that spilled across his screen made his stomach drop somewhere around his ankles. Tactical assessments, diplomatic channels, authorization codes that would make a colonel weep with envy. "So," David said carefully, not looking up from the screen. "Standard reconnaissance, you said." The silence behind him felt heavy enough to have mass. He turned. Lyren's expression had shifted into something carefully blank, which told him everything. "Those markings on your armor, I thought they were decorative. They're not, are they?" "David." "Command-level encryption. Strategic oversight clearance. Either you stole this from someone very important or—" He stopped, realization settling like cold metal in his chest. "You're not just a soldier." Lyren's hands rested flat on the workbench, her posture rigid. "No. How not just a soldier are we talking? Because there's a significant difference between senior officer and person whose capture could start an interstellar incident." "Closer to second one." David laughed, slightly hysterical. "Wonderful. I've been harboring someone whose ransom value probably exceeds my workshop's entire net worth. My mother always said I'd amount to something impressive. That should have let me die. Lyren's voice was quiet. Now you are dangerous to both our peoples. Yeah, well, too late for that particular regret. David scrolled through more files, his engineer's brain automatically cataloging patterns. Wait, these combat reports from your ambush. The attack vectors are wrong. This wasn't random enemy contact. Lyren's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was deliberate. Someone on your side set you up. He looked at her, saw the carefully controlled hurt beneath the stoic exterior. That's why you won't tell me what happened. You don't know who to trust. Trust is luxury, Lyren said, for people not betrayed. David shut down the files, his mind racing through implications. Colonial security had been running random sweeps lately, following reports of unusual energy signatures. His power consumption had been abnormally high, medical equipment running constantly, extra environmental controls. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed. We have a problem, he said. Have many problems. Fair point. But this one's immediate. He pulled up the security bulletin on his secondary screen. They're tightening patrols, looking for irregularities. We're basically a glowing irregularity with a neon sign. Lyren studied the bulletin, her damaged translator rendering enough for comprehension. How long? Days, maybe less if we're unlucky. Always unlucky on Tuesdays, she said, and despite everything, David found himself smiling. You're learning. Colonial security arrived on a morning so cold that frost actually formed on New Hebron's red dirt, which the meteorologists would later call a statistical anomaly, and David would call terrible timing. Lieutenant Morrison stood at the door with two junior officers, his scanner already reading David's power consumption patterns. Routine inspection, Reeves. You've been running hot lately. Late nights, David said, blocking the entrance with what he hoped looked like casual posture rather than panic. Big project, very technical, lots of equipment. Beneath his feet, in a shielded maintenance crawlspace barely large enough for one person, and certainly not designed for someone still healing from plasma burns, Lyren was undoubtedly in considerable pain. David tried not to think about it. Morrison's eyes narrowed. You look terrible. Thank you. I've been working on that aesthetic. The inspection was thorough. Morrison poked through equipment, made notes on his tablet, commented on David's organizational system with the kind of disdain that suggested he'd never actually fixed anything in his life. David made small talk, laughed at appropriate moments, and felt sweat collecting under his collar despite the cold. You're nervous, Morrison observed. You're armed and questioning my power bill. It's a natural response. After 20 minutes that felt like geological epochs, they left. David waited until their transport was properly distant before opening the crawlspace. Lyren emerged slowly, her face tight with suppressed pain. Comfortable? David asked. Delightful should mark it as luxury accommodation. But the close call had forced what they'd both been avoiding. Lyren could travel now, barely, but enough. Staying meant capture for both of them. Her own people might be hunting her. The ceasefire zones were monitored, and his workshop had become a cage with closing walls. That night, they sat surrounded by equipment David was cataloging for abandonment. Lyren had been quiet for hours. Why, she finally asked. Why what? Why help still? Could turn me in, save yourself. David considered his answer carefully. I've spent 5 years fixing machines for a colony I don't believe in, following orders from people I don't respect, pretending that's enough. When I found you bleeding out, that was the first time in years I made a choice that actually mattered. Lyren's amber eyes studied him. Will cost everything. I wasn't using it anyway. David pulled up star charts on his screen, highlighting smuggler routes through the asteroid fields. I know people. Not good people, but people who don't ask questions. We can get to neutral territory. You think I'm staying here after harboring an enemy commander? My career in atmospheric processing is thoroughly finished. Something that might have been gratitude crossed her face. David. Besides, you still haven't explained those Taran energy matrices properly. I have questions. Many questions. She almost smiled. Take years to explain. Good thing we'll have travel time. They spent the remaining hours preparing. David packed tools, identity chips he could fake, enough equipment to start over somewhere that didn't care about colonial regulations or military allegiances. Lyren checked her armor, now repaired enough to function, the elaborate markings catching the light. "What were you?" David asked. "Before you became a fugitive, I mean." "Person who gave orders, now person who refuses them." "What kind of orders?" "Kind that cost civilian lives." Her expression hardened. "Said no, they said traitor." David understood then. They were the same, caught between loyalty and conscience, choosing the harder path because the alternative meant becoming someone they couldn't recognize. As dawn broke over New Hebron's red landscape, they loaded the last supplies. Two fugitives bound by a secret that could reshape worlds, running toward something neither could name. "Ready?" David asked. Lyren settled into the transport's co-pilot seat, her damaged translator finally rendering full sentences. "No, but going anyway." "That's the spirit." The engines hummed to life, and David pointed them toward the stars, leaving behind everything familiar for something that felt, against all logic, like freedom.